Picture this, mate. You wake up in absolute darkness, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of your surroundings, it's the stench. Imagine the worst public toilet you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 100, then add the sweet smell of gangrene, rotting teeth, and human desperation that's been fermenting in 40-degree heat for months on end. Welcome to your first morning in Colonial, Australia, where your worst camping trip would feel like a 5-star resort, where a bad day at work means death by flogging, and where that dodgy kebab you had last weekend would be considered a gourmet feast worth killing for. You think you've had tough times because your Wi-Fi went down for an hour? You reckon you could handle a bit of rough living because you survived a music festival without proper showers? Think again, cobber. In the world we're about to explore, a single infected mosquito bite could mean watching your leg rot off while fully conscious. Medical treatment involved drinking mercury until your teeth fell out, and your daily protein came from weevil-infested flour that moved when you tried to eat it. Colonial Australia, that sun-soaked paradise from your holiday brochures, was actually a death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic efficiency. Every single sunrise brought new and creative ways to die, suffer, or watch everyone around you slowly waste away from diseases that would make medieval plagues look like mild inconveniences. Tonight, we're diving into the visceral reality of Australia's colonial nightmare, where 73% of transported convicts died within their first 5 years, where punishment was so brutal that prisoners begged to be hanged instead, and where the land of opportunity was actually a carefully orchestrated system of human disposal disguised as justice. You'll discover why Norfolk Island was called Hell on Earth by people who'd survived actual war zones, what that mysterious, brown substance in their drinking water really was, and the horrifying truth about how they dealt with the constant stream of dead bodies that piled up faster than they could dig graves. So settle into your comfortable bed, appreciate your clean water and reliable electricity, and prepare to understand exactly why you wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a world where weakness meant becoming fertilizer for someone else's vegetable garden, and strength meant watching your mates die while pretending you didn't care. Let's start by destroying the biggest lie they taught you in school, shall we? Transportation to Australia wasn't an alternative to execution. It was execution with extra steps, designed to look humane while achieving the same result more efficiently. The numbers alone should make your blood run cold. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain transported approximately 165,000 convicts to Australia. Within 5 years of arrival, roughly 120,000 of them were dead. Not from old age, not from accidents, but from systematic brutality disguised as colonial administration. But here's the secret that history books conveniently forget. This wasn't accidental. The British government had done the mathematics. Transportation cost roughly half as much as long-term imprisonment, and the death rates were so predictable that they could budget for replacement convicts with actuarial precision. Your modern mind can't process the casual efficiency of it all. Ships would arrive with 200 prisoners, knowing that 150 would be dead within months. The colonial authorities would plan accordingly: housing for 50 long-term residents, medical supplies for maybe 20, and burial space calculated by projected mortality rates rather than actual population. The voyage itself was designed to pre-select survivors through systematic elimination of the weak. Picture being chained below deck for 6 months, sharing space with 200 other desperate people, while the ship's hull leaked seawater that mixed with human waste to create a toxic soup that you'd be standing in ankle deep. The food on these ships would make your worst prison documentary look like a cooking show. Maggoty beef that had been salted so heavily, it would strip the lining from your mouth. Ship's biscuits so infested with weevils that experienced convicts would tap them against the hull to shake out the larger insects before eating them anyway. And water that had been stored in barrels previously used for transporting whale oil. But here's where it gets properly nauseating. The ship's surgeons were paid per living convict delivered, not per convict embarked. This created perverse incentives where medical care was rationed based on survival probability rather than medical need. If you looked likely to die anyway, treatment would be withheld to save resources for more promising cases. The mortality selection process was coldly systematic. Convicts who became seasick during the first week were marked as weak constitution and received reduced rations. Those who developed scurvy within the first month were classified as poor long-term prospects and denied access to what little fresh food was available. By the time the ship reached Australian waters, the survivors had been pre-selected for physical resilience through a process that would make Nazi medical experiments look restrained. Landing in Sydney Cove wasn't rescue, it was the beginning of the real nightmare. The climate alone would have killed most modern Australians within weeks. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius, with humidity levels that made breathing feel like drowning in hot soup. There was no air conditioning, no electric fans, not even proper shade structures for the first decade of settlement. The work assignments were calculated to extract maximum labor value before death became inevitable. Road gangs working in chains, under the Australian sun, with water rations designed to keep them functional rather than healthy. Quarry work where rock dust would shred their lungs within months, but the limestone was needed for construction, so medical concerns were irrelevant. Housing was whatever could be thrown together using local materials and convict labor. Picture bark huts that provided no insulation from heat or cold, with roofs that leaked during every rainstorm, and walls that offered no protection from the insects, snakes, and spiders that considered these structures convenient hunting grounds. The food supply chain was a masterpiece of bureaucratic sadism. Convicts received weekly rations calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain work capacity, but not enough to build up strength for escape attempts or resistance. The calculations were precise: 7 pounds of flour, 4 pounds of salt, pork, and 3 pounds of rice per week. Sounds adequate until you realize the flour was often 30% sawdust, the pork was rancid more often than not, and the rice came with its own ecosystem of insects and rodents. But the real genius of the system was psychological rather than physical. Hope was systematically eliminated through a process they called moral reformation. Convicts were told that good behavior could earn them freedom, but the standards for good behavior were impossible to meet and constantly changing. Your 7-year sentence could become 14 years for insolence, which was defined as anything from speaking without permission to making facial expressions that suggested disagreement with authority. 14 years could become life imprisonment for inciting rebellion, which included discussing working conditions with other convicts or expressing homesickness in letters that were censored anyway. The ticket of leave system was designed to maintain hope while ensuring disappointment. Convicts who survived their initial sentence could apply for conditional freedom, but the approval process required character references from officials who had incentives to maintain the labor supply. Freedom was dangled like a carrot on a stick that was systematically moved further away every time someone got close to reaching it. Female convicts faced additional horrors that would make your modern sensibilities shut down completely. The assignment system meant that women were distributed to male settlers as unpaid domestic workers, with no legal protection against sexual assault, physical abuse, or murder. The colonial authorities knew exactly what was happening, but female convicts were considered disposable resources rather than human beings deserving protection. The marriage system for female convicts was prostitution with paperwork. Women were lined up at markets where male settlers could inspect them like livestock, checking their teeth, examining their bodies for disease, and negotiating terms for domestic service that everyone understood included sexual availability. Refusal wasn't an option. Women who declined assignments were sent to female factories where conditions were designed to break their resistance through systematic dehumanization. Medical care was whatever could be improvised using local plants and folk remedies that were more likely to cause poisoning than healing. The colonial surgeons were often convicts themselves, transported for grave robbing or practicing medicine, without proper training. Their pharmaceutical knowledge came from trial and error on previous patients, with a success rate that made Russian roulette look like a safe bet. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthetic, using tools that were cleaned with whatever alcohol was available, in conditions that would make a medieval battlefield hospital look sterile. Amputation was the standard treatment for any injury that showed signs of infection, performed by holding the patient down while sawing through bone with carpenter's tools. The death rate from medical treatment was higher than the death rate from avoiding medical treatment entirely. Convicts learned to hide injuries and illnesses because seeking help was often fatal. This created a selection pressure where only those with exceptional immune systems and pain tolerance could survive long enough to complete their sentences. Aboriginal resistance added another layer of mortality that colonial records deliberately understated. The indigenous population wasn't passively accepting European invasion. They were conducting sophisticated warfare, using tactics that European military training hadn't prepared colonists to handle. Spear attacks could come from any direction, at any time, with Aboriginal warriors who could disappear into landscape that looked empty to European eyes. Poisoned water sources, coordinated raids on isolated settlements, and psychological warfare that left colonists in constant fear of invisible enemies who knew the terrain better than any European could hope to learn. The colonial response was genocide disguised as law enforcement. But it was inefficient genocide that created more problems than it solved. Massacre raids would eliminate some Aboriginal groups while driving others to more determined resistance, creating cycles of violence that made survival even more precarious for everyone involved. Disease was the most efficient killer, but it worked both ways. European diseases decimated Aboriginal populations, but Australian diseases that indigenous people had developed immunity to were equally devastating to European immune systems. Tropical fevers, parasitic infections, and bacterial diseases that thrived in the Australian climate would sweep through convict populations with regularity that made planning impossible. Let me tell you about Sarah Mitchell, not her real name. But we'll call her that because her story perfectly illustrates why your gentle modern soul wouldn't survive a single day in her nightmare world. Sarah was transported to New South Wales in 1823, convicted of stealing bread to feed her starving children back in Manchester. Her crime was survival, her punishment was designed to be death, and her journey into hell began the moment she stepped aboard the transport ship Lady Juliana. The ship's manifest listed her as female convict, aged 19, sentenced 7 years, crime theft. What it didn't record was that she was 3 months pregnant when she boarded, a condition that would transform her transportation from mere brutality into something approaching medieval torture. The voyage took 6 months, during which Sarah was chained below deck with 180 other women in a space designed for perhaps 50. The pregnant women weren't given additional space or considerations. Pregnancy was considered a self-inflicted condition that deserved no special treatment. Morning sickness had to be endured while chained in place, with vomit joining the cocktail of human waste that sloshed around their feet as the ship rolled through Southern Ocean swells. The food rations were calculated for non-pregnant women, meaning Sarah was slowly starving while her body tried to build another human being. The ship's surgeon noticed her condition during a cursory health inspection, but made no recommendation for additional nutrition. Pregnant convicts who survived the voyage would produce children who could be raised as colonial workers, but maternal survival wasn't considered essential to this process. By month 4 of the voyage, Sarah was showing signs of severe malnutrition. Her teeth were loosening from scurvy, her hair was falling out in clumps, and her pregnant belly was grotesquely prominent on her increasingly skeletal frame. The other women in her section began taking bets on whether she'd survive to give birth, and whether the baby would be born alive or dead. The betting wasn't callous entertainment. It was a psychological coping mechanism that allowed them to maintain some sense of agency in a situation where they had no control over anything, including their own survival. Gambling on death and suffering was how they processed their own mortality, without going completely insane. Sarah's labor began during a storm in the Great Australian Bight, 3 weeks before the ship was scheduled to reach Sydney. The conditions were nightmarish beyond modern comprehension. She was giving birth while chained in place in complete darkness, with seawater pouring through gaps in the hull while the ship pitched violently in seas that threatened to break it apart entirely. The other women did what they could to help, but their resources were limited to shared body warmth and whispered encouragement. There was no medical equipment, no clean water, no privacy, and no possibility of hygiene. Sarah delivered her daughter directly onto the filthy deck, surrounded by the waste and vomit of 180 desperate women, while the ship's hull groaned and creaked like it might split apart at any moment. The baby survived the birth, but survival in those conditions was a cruel joke. There was no clean cloth for swaddling, no safe place to sleep, no adequate nutrition for a nursing mother who was already severely malnourished. Sarah named her daughter Hope, a name that would prove ironically appropriate for all the wrong reasons. Hope died 19 days after birth, not from any single cause, but from the accumulated stress of conditions that were incompatible with human life. Sarah held her daughter's tiny body for hours before the other women gently convinced her to let them dispose of it through one of the ship's portholes. There would be no burial, no funeral, no recognition that a human life had ended. Just another small body disappearing into the Southern Ocean. The psychological impact of losing hope while still chained in the ship's hold broke something fundamental in Sarah's personality. Modern psychology would recognize this as severe traumatic stress disorder, but in 1823 it was just another example of moral weakness that deserved punishment rather than treatment. When the ship finally reached Sydney Cove, Sarah was assigned to a settler named James Whitmore, who owned a small farm about 50 kilometers inland from the coast. The assignment papers described her as suitable for domestic service and agricultural labor, making no mention of her recent childbirth, her malnourished condition, or her psychological state. Whitmore's farm was a collection of bark huts surrounded by partially cleared land that was being converted from bush to pasture using convict labor. Sarah's accommodation was a shed she shared with 3 other assigned women, with earthen floors, no windows, and a roof that leaked whenever it rained. The smell was a permanent mixture of human sweat, wood smoke, and something that might have been rotting vegetation or decomposing animal matter. Her daily schedule would make your modern work-life balance look like a luxury vacation. Up at dawn, to milk cows whose udders were often infected and painful to touch. Breakfast was whatever could be scraped together from the previous night's leftovers, usually cold porridge made from flour that had been stored long enough to develop its own ecosystem of insects and mold. Morning work involved hauling water from a creek that was contaminated with runoff from other farms upstream, meaning every bucket she carried contained traces of human waste, animal decomposition, and chemical runoff from soap-making operations that used caustic substances banned in modern manufacturing. The laundry process would make your worst laundromat experience look like a spa treatment. Sarah had to boil clothes in large iron pots over open fires, using soap made from animal fat and wood ash that would burn her hands raw. The water was heated by burning whatever fuel could be found, usually dried animal dung mixed with scraps of wood that produced toxic smoke that would sear her lungs and leave her coughing blood by evening. Afternoon work meant food preparation, using ingredients that would horrify modern health inspectors. Meat that had been preserved with salt but was often already decomposing when it arrived. Vegetables grown in soil fertilized with human waste, and grains that had been stored in conditions that encouraged both insect infestation and fungal contamination. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical hardship. Sarah was completely isolated from any emotional support system, surrounded by people who viewed her as disposable property rather than a human being deserving basic consideration. She couldn't express grief for her lost daughter, couldn't show weakness or exhaustion, couldn't even maintain privacy for basic bodily functions. Whitmore treated her exactly as colonial law intended, as a resource to be exploited until it was exhausted, then replaced. When Sarah developed a persistent cough from smoke inhalation, his concern wasn't for her health, but for her productivity. When she showed signs of depression from isolation and trauma, his response was increased workload rather than reduced stress. The sexual dynamics were never explicitly discussed, but were understood by everyone involved. Sarah had no legal protection against sexual assault, no recourse if Whitmore decided her duties included sexual availability, and no alternative if she found his advances repugnant. Resistance could mean reassignment to harsher conditions, extension of her sentence, or punishment that could include flogging severe enough to cause permanent disability. The other assigned women had developed coping strategies that Sarah had to learn quickly or face even worse treatment. They'd learned to anticipate Whitmore's moods and adjust their behavior accordingly, to appear busy even when there was no meaningful work to do, and to maintain the appearance of submission while preserving some small core of personal dignity. But Sarah's trauma from losing hope had damaged her ability to read social situations and respond appropriately. She'd sometimes stare into space for hours, lost in memories of holding her dying daughter, which Whitmore interpreted as laziness deserving punishment. She'd occasionally break down crying for reasons she couldn't explain, which he saw as manipulation, designed to avoid work responsibilities. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal summer when temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius for weeks at a time. The physical stress of outdoor labor in that heat would challenge modern athletes with proper hydration and rest. For malnourished convict women, with no access to adequate water or shelter, it was essentially a slow death sentence. Sarah began, showing signs of heat exhaustion, nausea, dizziness, confusion, and eventually inability to perform even basic tasks. Modern medical knowledge would recognize this as a life-threatening emergency, requiring immediate cooling and fluid replacement. Whitmore's response was to increase her workload as punishment for what he interpreted as deliberate laziness. The final incident that destroyed Sarah's will to survive happened during a wheat harvest that had to be completed before seasonal rains arrived. She was working in fields under direct sunlight, cutting grain with a scythe while her vision blurred from dehydration, and her hands bled from blisters that had burst and become infected. When she collapsed from heat stroke, Whitmore's immediate response wasn't medical assistance but fury at the work interruption. He kicked her unconscious body repeatedly while screaming about lazy convicts who expected to be coddled, then ordered the other women to drag her to the punishment shed where she'd be denied food and water until she was ready to work properly. Sarah regained consciousness in complete darkness, locked in a wooden box barely large enough for her to lie down, with temperatures inside approaching 60 degrees Celsius. The punishment shed was designed to break resistant convicts through sensory deprivation, combined with extreme heat that would induce hallucinations and psychological breakdown. She spent 4 days in that box, receiving minimal water and no food, while her body slowly shut down from dehydration and heat poisoning. Modern medical science tells us that survival in those conditions was virtually impossible. But Sarah's body somehow maintained basic functions long enough for her to experience something that would have been classified as divine intervention in a more religious age, but which was actually the result of Whitmore's economic calculations. Dead convicts couldn't work, and replacement convicts cost money that Whitmore didn't want to spend. When Sarah was on the verge of death, he ordered her removal from the punishment shed, not from compassion, but from financial pragmatism. A convict who died from punishment was a loss of investment that affected his profit margins, but the psychological damage was permanent and complete. Sarah had learned that survival required the total suppression of everything that made her human: empathy, hope, dignity, and even basic self-preservation instincts. She became what the colonial system was designed to create: a functional automaton that could perform labor without requiring consideration as a human being. Now let me tell you about Thomas Chen, a different kind of victim, whose story illustrates another aspect of colonial brutality that history books prefer to forget. Thomas wasn't a convict. He was a free Chinese immigrant who'd paid his own passage to Australia in 1851, drawn by gold rush stories that promised wealth and opportunity for anyone willing to work hard. His crime was believing that colonial Australia operated according to the same moral rules as human civilization. The ship that brought Thomas to Melbourne was technically a passenger vessel rather than a convict transport, but the conditions were nearly identical. Chinese passengers were segregated into the lowest decks, given minimal food rations, and treated as cargo rather than human beings who'd paid for transportation. The voyage took 4 months, during which Thomas learned his first harsh lesson about Australian racial dynamics. European passengers received meals that were adequate if not luxurious, while Chinese passengers received rice rations that were calculated to prevent starvation, but not to maintain health. When Thomas complained about the quality of food he'd paid for, he was told that Chinese dietary preferences were being accommodated, and that further complaints would result in reduced rations. The sleeping arrangements were designed to reinforce racial hierarchy through systematic humiliation. Chinese passengers were packed into holds with no privacy, no individual sleeping spaces, and sanitation facilities that were inadequate for the number of people forced to use them. The message was clear. Even paying customers deserved degraded treatment if they weren't European. But Thomas was educated, spoke fluent English, and had enough money to establish himself in the gold fields around Ballarat. He believed that his skills, work ethic, and financial resources would earn him the same respect accorded to other immigrants who'd paid their way to Australia. This belief nearly got him killed within his first week on the goldfields. The mining camps around Ballarat were governed by informal hierarchies that placed Chinese miners at the bottom, regardless of their skills, experience, or financial resources. Thomas discovered that claims he'd legally purchased were considered invalid by European miners who wanted those areas for themselves. When he attempted to work his legally acquired claim, He was informed that Chinese miners were only allowed to work areas that European miners had already abandoned as unprofitable. This wasn't just discrimination, it was systematic resource theft disguised as racial policy. Chinese miners were forced to pay higher fees for inferior claims, charged extra taxes that didn't apply to European miners, and denied access to equipment suppliers who'd sell tools and supplies to Europeans, but not to Chinese customers. Thomas's response was to work harder and smarter than his European competitors, using mining techniques he'd learned in China that were more efficient than the crude methods favored by Australian prospectors. His success was his death sentence. When Thomas began extracting significant gold from claims that Europeans had dismissed as worthless, the response wasn't admiration for his skill, but fury at his presumption. The local miners' committee decided that Chinese success was evidence of cheating, theft, or some other form of illegitimate advantage that justified violent correction. The first attack came at night, when a group of European miners destroyed Thomas's equipment and filled in his mining shafts. When he complained to local authorities, he was told that Chinese miners were responsible for protecting their own property and that police resources couldn't be wasted on disputes between foreigners. The second attack was more personal. Thomas was beaten unconscious while walking back to his camp, robbed of his gold dust and tools, and left with injuries that would have required modern medical attention to heal properly. The message was clear. Chinese success would not be tolerated, regardless of legal rights or moral considerations. But Thomas made the mistake that killed most Chinese immigrants who tried to establish themselves in colonial Australia. He believed that justice and law were the same thing. He reported the assault to authorities, provided detailed descriptions of his attackers, and requested police protection for Chinese miners who were being systematically targeted. The response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic sadism. Thomas was informed that assault charges required witnesses, but Chinese testimony wasn't considered reliable evidence against European defendants. He was told that police protection was available for purchase, but the fees were calculated to be higher than most Chinese miners could afford. He was advised that Chinese miners who continued to file complaints would be investigated for possible immigration violations that could result in deportation. The final message from authorities was delivered with bureaucratic politeness that masked genocidal intent. Chinese miners were welcome in Australia as long as they accepted their designated place in the racial hierarchy, which meant working harder for less reward while accepting abuse as the price of being allowed to remain. Thomas's breaking point came when he witnessed the gang rape of a Chinese woman who'd been brought to the goldfields as a purchased wife. The attack happened in broad daylight, with dozens of witnesses, and was carried out by European miners who made no attempt to conceal their identities. When Thomas attempted to intervene, he was beaten unconscious and left for dead. The woman died from her injuries 3 days later, but there was no investigation, no arrests, and no recognition that a crime had been committed. Local authorities classified the incident as a domestic dispute that didn't warrant official intervention, despite the fact that everyone involved knew exactly what had happened. This was Thomas's introduction to the true nature of colonial Australian justice. Law existed to protect European interests, not to ensure fair treatment for all residents. Chinese immigrants could be robbed, assaulted, raped, or killed with virtual impunity, as long as the perpetrators were European and the victims were Chinese. But the story gets worse, because Thomas made one final mistake that sealed his fate. He began organizing other Chinese miners to pool their resources for collective protection, reasoning that organized self-defense was their only option in a system that denied them legal protection. The response was swift and brutal. Organized Chinese resistance was classified as potential rebellion that threatened colonial security. Thomas was arrested on fabricated charges, tried in a court where Chinese testimony wasn't admissible evidence, and sentenced to 2 years hard labor for inciting racial discord. His sentence was served at Cockatoo Island, where convict labor was used for ship repair and construction projects that required skills Thomas didn't possess. The work assignments were designed to be impossible for him to complete successfully, creating justification for extended punishment that could prolong his sentence indefinitely. The daily routine at Cockatoo Island would make your worst job look like a paid vacation. Thomas was woken at 4 a.m. by guards who used clubs and boots rather than verbal commands. Breakfast was thin gruel made from flour that was more sawdust than wheat, served in bowls that hadn't been cleaned since the previous day's use. Work assignments involved quarrying stone using hand tools while wearing leg irons that made walking difficult and running impossible. The stone dust would shred his lungs over months of exposure, but respiratory protection wasn't provided because convict health wasn't considered worth the expense of safety equipment. The heat during Australian summers made outdoor labor potentially fatal, but work quotas had to be met regardless of weather conditions. Thomas learned to pace himself to avoid heat exhaustion, but falling behind quota meant reduced food rations that would weaken him further and make meeting future quotas even more difficult. But the psychological warfare was more devastating than physical hardship. Thomas was systematically isolated from other Chinese convicts to prevent collective resistance, forced to work alongside men who'd been encouraged to see Chinese prisoners as acceptable targets for violence and sexual assault. The guards deliberately created situations where European convicts could abuse Chinese prisoners without consequences, reasoning that racial conflict among convicts would prevent organized resistance against authority. Thomas was beaten, robbed, and sexually assaulted on a regular basis while authorities pretended not to notice what was happening. His survival strategy was to become invisible, working efficiently but not effectively enough to attract attention, avoiding eye contact and conversation that might provoke confrontation, and enduring abuse without resistance that could justify increased punishment. But invisibility had its own psychological costs. Thomas gradually lost his sense of personal identity, his connection to cultural traditions that had sustained him, and eventually his will to survive beyond completing his sentence. He became what the colonial system was designed to create, a broken human being who posed no threat to established authority. Thomas completed his sentence in 1854, 3 years after arriving in Australia with hopes and dreams that colonial reality had systematically destroyed. He was released with no resources, no support system, and psychological damage that modern therapy might have helped, but which 1850s Australia offered no treatment for. His post-release survival depended on accepting employment that was designed to keep him permanently impoverished and socially isolated. Chinese ex-convicts were employed in jobs that Europeans wouldn't accept, cleaning sewers, disposing of dead animals, and handling materials that were considered too dangerous or disgusting for European workers. Thomas died in 1857, 3 years after his release, from what modern medical science would recognize as complications from silicosis caused by years of stone dust inhalation. His death was recorded as natural causes, with no recognition of the systematic abuse that had destroyed his health, dreams, and humanity. But let me tell you about the most horrifying story of all, the tale of convict children whose suffering makes adult experiences look merciful by comparison. Meet young Billy Crawford, aged 8 when he was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1835 for the crime of stealing apples to survive on London streets. His story illustrates why childhood in colonial Australia was a nightmare that would make modern child protection advocates weep with rage. Billy's crime was hunger. His punishment was designed to break his spirit before he developed the strength to resist authority, and his experience reveals the systematic brutality that colonial authorities inflicted on children who'd committed no real crimes beyond being born into poverty. The voyage to Van Diemen's Land was Billy's introduction to hell. Child convicts weren't separated from adult prisoners. They were mixed together in holds where sexual abuse, violence, and exploitation were routine occurrences that ship's officers ignored as inevitable consequences of criminal transportation. Billy was small even for an 8-year-old, malnourished from years of street survival that had stunted his physical development, but accelerated his psychological maturity in ways that would horrify modern child psychologists. He'd learned to recognize predatory behavior, to make himself invisible when violence was brewing, and to trade whatever he possessed for temporary protection from older, stronger prisoners. The adult convicts treated Billy exactly as colonial law intended, as future criminal who deserved no compassion or protection. Some saw him as easy prey for sexual abuse, others as a convenient target for violence that they couldn't safely direct toward guards or each other. A few treated him with protective kindness, but these relationships were dangerous because any sign of emotional attachment was seen as weakness that could be exploited. Billy learned to survive by becoming useful to stronger prisoners in ways that didn't compromise his safety, but which provided some protection from the worst abuse. He became a messenger, carrying information between prisoners who couldn't communicate directly, and a lookout who could warn of approaching guards or brewing conflicts. But usefulness came with costs that no child should have to pay. Billy witnessed sexual assaults, beatings, and murders that would traumatize adult observers. But showing emotional reaction was dangerous because it marked him as weak and suitable for victimization. He learned to watch horror with apparent indifference while processing trauma that would require decades of modern therapy to heal. The ship's surgeon examined Billy once during the voyage, noted that he was small but healthy, and made no recommendations for special care or protection. Child convicts were expected to adapt to adult conditions without accommodation for their age, size, or developmental needs. Billy's arrival in Van Diemen's Land was the beginning of systematic child abuse disguised as moral reformation. He was assigned to a settler named Robert Hayes, who owned a sheep station in the island's interior, where child labor was used for tasks that adult convicts found too dangerous or degrading to accept. The work assignments were calculated to break Billy's will while extracting maximum labor value from his small body. He was required to work 14-hour days herding sheep in terrain that included cliffs, rivers, and wilderness areas where getting lost could mean death from exposure or wild animal attack. His accommodation was a wooden box that was too small for him to stand upright, with no bedding beyond straw that was changed when it became too infested with insects to ignore. The box was designed to be uncomfortable enough to prevent restful sleep, while providing minimal protection from weather that could range from freezing cold to dangerous heat within the same 24-hour period. Food rations were calculated for adult prisoners, then reduced by half for child convicts on the theory that smaller bodies required less nutrition. This meant Billy was chronically malnourished during crucial developmental years, resulting in stunted growth, dental problems, and learning difficulties that would affect him for life. But the real horror was psychological rather than physical. Billy was completely isolated from any adult who might provide emotional support, guidance, or protection. Hayes treated him as malfunctioning equipment that required constant supervision and frequent punishment to maintain productivity, not as a developing human being who needed care and instruction. The punishment system for child convicts was designed to create learned helplessness through systematic terror. Billy's first infraction, failing to prevent a sheep from wandering into a creek, resulted in 25 lashes with a cat-o'-nine-tails that left permanent scars on his back. The punishment was administered by Hayes personally, who explained that child convicts needed to learn consequences for failure while they were still young enough to be properly trained. Modern child psychology tells us that systematic abuse during crucial developmental years creates personality disorders, attachment problems, and behavioral issues that can persist throughout life. Colonial authorities knew this too, but considered it a feature rather than a bug. Broken children were less likely to become rebellious adults who threatened established authority. Billy's education consisted of learning to read punishment, orders, and write reports about his daily activities, skills that were taught not for his benefit, but to make him a more efficient form of property. Child convicts who could read and write were valuable because they could serve as clerks, bookkeepers, and administrators in situations where using adult convict labor would be inappropriate. But literacy also meant Billy could understand the legal documents that governed his existence, and what he learned would have driven an adult to despair. His original 7-year sentence could be extended for any infraction, however minor, and the definition of infractions was deliberately broad enough to ensure that extension was nearly inevitable. Speaking without permission, showing insufficient enthusiasm for work assignments, or displaying emotional reactions to punishment were all classified as insubordination that justified sentence extension. Billy learned that survival required the complete suppression of normal childhood behaviors. Curiosity, playfulness, emotional expression, and social interaction were all dangerous luxuries that could result in increased punishment. The sexual abuse began when Billy was 9, administered by Hayes as part of what he called moral instruction. Child convicts had no legal protection against sexual assault, no recourse for complaint, and no alternative if they found their treatment unbearable. Resistance would result in punishment severe enough to cause permanent physical damage. Submission meant enduring abuse that would create psychological trauma lasting decades. Billy's response was dissociation, learning to mentally separate from his physical body during abuse. viewing the experience as something happening to someone else rather than to himself. Modern psychology recognizes this as a survival mechanism that protects core personality from trauma, but which also creates long-term problems with emotional regulation and interpersonal relationships. By age 10, Billy had developed what modern medicine would classify as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but which colonial authorities saw as successful moral reformation. He was obedient, hardworking, and showed no signs of rebellious attitude that might threaten colonial authority. But the system had one final cruelty waiting: the transition to adult convict status that occurred when child prisoners reached puberty. Billy's psychological development had been so severely disrupted that he possessed neither the emotional maturity of a normal teenager nor the survival skills necessary for adult convict life. At age 14, Billy was transferred to adult convict barracks, where he was expected to compete with men who'd learned to survive through violence, intimidation, and exploitation of weakness. His small size, damaged psychological state, and complete lack of adult social skills made him an immediate target for abuse that was more severe than anything he'd experienced as a child convict. The adult convicts treated Billy exactly as he'd been trained to expect, as property to be used for labor, sexual gratification, or entertainment value depending on their needs and preferences. He had no allies, no resources, and no skills for protecting himself in an environment where weakness was a death sentence. Billy lasted 6 months in adult convict conditions before dying from what official records listed as natural causes, but which modern medical analysis would recognize as suicide by deliberate self-neglect. He'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped maintaining basic hygiene until his body simply shut down from accumulated stress and malnutrition. His death was unremarkable by colonial standards. Child convicts had mortality rates approaching 60% before reaching adulthood, and Billy's case wasn't unusual enough to warrant investigation or policy changes. He was buried in an unmarked grave with other convict dead, his name entered in ledgers that recorded property disposal rather than human death. And so we reached the end of our journey, mate. Our journey into a land that promised freedom but delivered systematic destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. Sarah's story, Thomas's story, little Billy's story. These weren't exceptions to colonial Australian policy. They were the intended results of a system designed to eliminate undesirable populations while maintaining the appearance of civilized justice. The sun that shines so beautifully on modern Australia, that same sun witnessed horrors that would make medieval torturers seem merciful. Systematic brutality disguised as moral reformation. Efficient elimination of human beings who'd committed no crimes beyond being born into poverty or having the wrong skin color. But here's what makes their suffering even more tragic, Cobber. It was all completely unnecessary. The resources existed to treat transported convicts humanely. The knowledge existed to prevent the diseases that killed them. The moral understanding existed to recognize their fundamental humanity. The choice was made deliberately, consciously, to use transportation as a form of slow execution that would solve Britain's crime problem by eliminating criminals rather than addressing the social conditions that created crime in the first place. Every sunrise in colonial Australia brought new opportunities for cruelty disguised as administration, new innovations in human suffering disguised as justice, new ways to break the human spirit while maintaining the legal fiction that transportation was merciful compared to execution. The heat that made outdoor labor potentially fatal. The authorities knew this. They had thermometers. They understood heat exhaustion. But work quotas were more important than human survival. The diseases that swept through convict populations. Medical knowledge existed to prevent many of these deaths. Basic sanitation could have saved thousands of lives. But dead convicts were cheaper than healthy ones. The systematic sexual abuse. This wasn't ignored because authorities didn't know it was happening. It was ignored because broken spirits were more manageable than intact human dignity. And the children. Sweet suffering Christ. The children were deliberately targeted because childhood trauma creates adults who can't effectively resist authority. Billy's abuse wasn't accidental. It was systematic preparation for a lifetime of submission. But here's the beautiful truth that makes their suffering meaningful, mate. You exist because humanity learned from their experience. Because enough people were horrified by colonial brutality to demand something better. Your modern world, with its imperfect but genuine legal protections, its recognition that children deserve special care, its understanding that human dignity transcends race and social class. This was built on the graves of people like Sarah and Thomas and Billy. Every human right you take for granted was purchased with the suffering of people who endured horrors beyond your imagination, so that future generations wouldn't have to experience the same brutality. Your comfortable bed, your clean water, your legal protections against arbitrary punishment. These aren't just conveniences. They're monuments to the memory of people who died to teach humanity what civilization actually means. The gentle darkness outside your window. It's not threatening. It's protective, wrapping around a world that learned to value human dignity because people like Sarah and Thomas and Billy paid the ultimate price for humanity's moral education. Rest now in the warmth of a world that was built on the foundation of their suffering. A world where children are protected rather than exploited. Where justice means protecting the innocent rather than punishing the inconvenient. Where strength means caring for the vulnerable rather than exploiting their weakness. Close your eyes. Let the peace of your modern world wash over you like a gentle tide. Steady, reliable, purchased with blood and tears and lives that were sacrificed so you could inherit something better. You wouldn't have lasted a day in colonial Australia, not because you lack courage or strength, but because you possess the moral sensitivity that colonial authorities deliberately destroyed in their victims. The beautiful weakness of caring about justice, the magnificent vulnerability of believing that human dignity matters more than administrative efficiency. Sleep well, you gentle soul. Dream of justice that protects rather than punishes, of authority that serves rather than exploits, of a world where children sleep safely because adults learn to value innocence above convenience. Your soft heart, your inability to watch suffering without trying to help, your belief that every human being deserves basic dignity. These aren't character flaws. They're the evolutionary gifts of a species that survived colonial brutality by developing moral systems that make such horrors impossible to repeat. The morning sun will rise on a world that Sarah and Thomas and Billy died to create. A world where their suffering has meaning because it taught humanity to build something better, something worthy of the price they paid. Sweet dreams, you magnificent descendant of survivors. You inheritor of a civilization built on the promise that such horrors must never happen again. You living proof that humanity can learn from its darkest chapters to create something approaching justice. If you survived this journey into colonial darkness, if you made it through these stories without losing your modern compassion, then you're ready for tomorrow's revelation. Because we're going to explore why pirates valued something more than gold, and what they truly treasured will change everything you thought you knew about wealth and desire. Subscribe now. Let the algorithm carry you into dreams of adventure, and sleep like the comfortable, protected soul you are. Wrapped in the embrace of a civilization that learned from colonial Australia's mistakes, that chose human dignity over administrative efficiency, that built a world where kindness is strength rather than weakness. The gentle night calls. Answer with the peaceful sleep of someone who lives in a world where justice has meaning, where childhood is protected, where human dignity transcends economic utility, where the strong have learned to care for the weak because people like Sarah and Thomas and Billy died to teach that lesson. Rest now. Colonial Australia is history. Its horrors buried under layers of progress and moral evolution. And you beautiful, sensitive soul, you inherited the world they died to make possible. A world where compassion is wisdom, where mercy is strength, where being too gentle for brutality is humanity's greatest achievement. Sweet dreams.